Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us at Middle Ground Book Fest. I am Jacqueline West, and I am delighted to be the moderator for this panel, which is called From YA to MG. I am joined by 4 amazing authors who work in both YA and middle grade fiction. We're going to introduce ourselves pretty briefly because 45 minutes flies by, and then we will dig into all my nosy questions. So I get to start. I am Jacqueline West, like I said, and my books include the spooky middle grade fantasy series, The Books of Elsewhere, which looks like this, the fantasy duology, The Collectors. I could never do this on StreamYard. There we go. My most recent YA is called Last Things and looks like this. Oh, it's too shiny. And then my most recent middle grade is called Long Lost. This just came out in May, and it is a mystery ghost story about a small town and a strange old library and a book that may not exist. So that's me in a nutshell. I'm going to go to Jasmine Warga next. Would you tell us about you and your work, please?
Yeah, hi, I am delighted to be here this morning too. I am the author of 2 young adult books, My Heart and Other Black Holes, and Here We Are Now. And then I have the middle grade books near me, so I'll put those ones up. I'm also the author of Other Words for Home and my newest middle grade novel, The Shape of Thunder.
Hooray. Thank you so much. All right, how about Akemi? Would you tell us about you?
Yeah, hi, my name is Akemi Bowman, and I'm the author of YA books that include Starfish, Summerbird Blue, Harley in the Sky, and most recently the Infinity Court series. And my debut middle grade, Generation Misfits, came out in June, so I don't have the book. I feel really unprepared.
I was gonna be like, I'm so prepared.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't give you warning. You need the stack of books beside you. It's all right. So
Okay.
Carlie, why don't we go to you next?
Hi, I'm Carlie Sorosiak. I have 2 YA books, If Birds Fly Back and Wild Blue Wonder, as well as 2 middle grade books, I, Cosmo, and Leonard, My Life as a Cat. And I also have 2 picture books that are coming out with Walker Books next year, Everywhere With You, and an untitled one that we haven't figured out the title for yet, but yeah.
All right, and Joy.
Hi, I'm Joy McCullough, and I also write picture book, middle grade, and YA. But my latest YA is We Are the Ashes, We Are the Fire, which is both in historical verse and contemporary prose. And my most recent middle grade is Across the Pond, which is about an American girl whose family inherits a castle in Scotland and moves there.
Fabulous. Oh, I'm so excited to talk to all of you. So, as many of us just hinted, a lot of us clearly do things beyond just YA and middle grade. We've got picture books. I know some of your backgrounds include adult fiction and so on. And I personally, in my publishing, have gone middle grade, YA, middle grade, YA, middle mid, and then YA again. So I know a lot of us step back and forth frequently. But I'd love to hear from each of you, where did you actually begin with writing attempts, not with publishing stuff, but what did you start out trying to do? Did you always know you wanted to write for young readers? What was the category you began in? Let's start with Carlie for this one.
Wonderful. So my first proper attempt at writing was actually an adult dystopian novel, and I worked on it for over a year before deciding that was definitely the wrong genre for me. And then I switched to YA while I was in graduate school, and then my first YA novel ended up being my debut. So yeah, adult dystopian. It was terrible. It was awful. I was reading it. I have like this whole stack of published novels, and it was definitely my worst.
But it's often there's that practice novel that you begin with. Funnily, my story is similar. The first novel I ever wrote, for some reason, is a realistic adult contemporary, which is like nothing else I've written since. And now it's in a box in my basement and no one else will ever see it. But Joy, I know you have a background in lots of other types of writing before you came to YA in middle grade, right?
Yeah, I started as a playwright. I studied theater in college, and I was just a playwright for about 15 years before fiction. But I started with middle grade, and my debut novel was YA, but I had written, it was the 10th manuscript I had written and queried and subbed. They didn't all get to sub, but 5 of them got to sub, so it took me a long time. But yeah, so I had written like 8 middle grades that didn't sell and 1 YA that didn't sell, and then I debuted with YA, but mostly it was middle grade. And then after that I've gone YA middle grade.
I love hearing that from authors, that you have that many that maybe weren't the perfect book at the right time, but that you kept going. It's so inspiring, I think, at least to me. Akemi, how about you? Where did you begin?
Yeah, so the one that got me an agent was YA, and I think I was firmly wanting to write YA at the time. But I think when I first started writing, I feel like I always wrote stuff that was kind of like my age into the characters. So when I started writing, I think it must have been middle grade, I guess. I mean, they were terrible, terrible books. I remember one was like about, there was this video game called Pets, and you could have like a virtual, like, I don't know if you guys ever played it, but it was like, I loved it so much that I was like, what if I was like lost on an island and there was like a bunch of wolves and dogs in it? And like, so that was basically the first book that I kind of wrote that was awful, but that kind of like made me fall in love with writing. But I think I was just writing my age, so I'm sure she was probably like 11 or something. So yeah, but yeah, I think seriously YA.
And how about you, Jasmine? Where did you start?
Yeah, when I first, I guess, really started seriously trying to write novels and had discovered that I wanted to write for younger readers, I started trying to write like whimsical, fantastical middle grade books were really my first attempts. And then my first YA book was one of my first attempts at contemporary YA, moving into that genre. And I haven't really returned back to that fantastical, whimsical middle grade, but I hope to someday. I think we're always growing as writers, right? And I think that I quickly learned that the place that I felt like the most confident was sort of like in voice and emotional stakes, which made contemporary YA easier, whereas I struggled a lot with like plotting, which is really a problem when you're trying to write like a fantastical big world middle grade. But I'm hoping to continue to improve those skills and then one day maybe return to that genre, because I think that is what made me like fall in love with middle grade.
Mm-hmm. Have any of you ever had a book surprise you? Like you started out thinking this is going to be YA or this is adult, and then you realize, oh no, this is a middle grade novel or this is something else entirely. And I'll ask, like, raise your hand or just speak up, because maybe not everyone has had this. Carlie, you've had this happen to you?
So I, Cosmo, which was my debut middle grade novel, was actually going to be a YA. And I was pitching the idea to my agent and to my friends. They were like, that's not a YA novel. You're writing middle grade. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm writing middle grade now. So that's what I got into it.
It's so good to have friends who know those things. I queried my first middle grade novel, because this is like a dozen years ago now, and I was a brand new author, and I don't think I even knew the term middle grade. I feel like that's still a term that kind of outside the book world, a lot of people don't know. I have to describe to a lot of friends what that means. And so, yeah, in my query letter, I referred to it as a young adult novel, even though it was like 26,000 words, and so obviously not. But I had, yes, very kind people point out to me, nope, that's middle grade. Anybody else have a book that surprised you or that transformed from one kind of category to another as you worked on it?
I do. My first middle grade, A Field Guide to Getting Lost, I actually wrote and we subbed as a chapter book, sort of an Ivy and Bean length chapter book that I was envisioning illustrations. And my editor, who ended up taking it on, but took it on saying, this is a middle grade novel, come back to me with a proposal of making it a middle grade. And then we went from there, and she was right.
Oh, cool. So this kind of segues nicely into my next question, which are, what do you think are the biggest differences between your own middle grade and YA work? Do you notice any big differences in voice or style, or in the kinds of plots you handle? Anything that's really different? Or does it feel like maybe these are just the exact same sort of voice with slightly different age protagonists? Akemi, you want to start us off with that one? What are the differences for you?
I think my most obvious one is just that it's third person past tense for the middle grade, and then first person present for YA. And that wasn't even really on purpose. I think it's just that my middle grade had like a bigger, more like a group cast. And so it made sense for the story. But otherwise, I think I'm like a very character driven writer. So like, regardless of how old they are or where they are, I feel like my kind of tone is always sort of the same, where I'm just trying to get into somebody's head and show what they're feeling. So I feel like that kind of is similar with both age ranges for me, but yeah.
Interesting. Jasmine, what about you?
Yeah, I relate to a lot of what Akemi said, because I'm sitting here trying to think like, what are the differences? And I guess it's a feel, which I know doesn't sound eloquent or smart, but for me, it's about honoring what it means to be 12 versus honoring what it means to be 16. And there is a difference there, and we all understand what that difference is, but it's sort of hard to quantify it, because it's never like this topic has to be YA, or this is too dark for 12-year-olds, or I can't use this word because it's for 12-year-olds. That never enters into my thinking. It's more about honoring, you know, what is your relationship with the world like when you're 12 versus what is your relationship with the world like when you're 16. And sometimes my books tackle similar questions, but I think that's the framework that kind of guides me. And it was definitely a harder transition when I was moving after having done 2 YA books. And I felt super strongly that Jude was 12. She came to me as 12. My editor in the first couple of passes of the book kept saying, "Are you sure this isn't a YA?" I was like, no, I know she's 12. And she's like, well, she doesn't sound like she's 12. And so it was a big discovery process of trying to figure out how to honor like that feel I had for it. And so for me, it's just like the texture, and you can tell when you read a YA book versus a middle grade book about that. But I don't think, at least for me, the guiding principle is never like, this concept is too difficult, so I'm going to write it for teens, or this concept is too whimsy, so I'm going to make it for middle grade. It's more about like, how does the character feel for me, and what kinds of questions are they asking them, and what lens through which they are asking those questions.
Yeah. So with the characters you were mentioning, like the 12-year-old, are you writing in first person in the middle grade as well? I know you write some in verse as well as in prose. And,
yeah. So all of my books so far have been in first person. Even my next book, which is a robot protagonist, is in first person. So I seem to be unable to shake first person, no matter how far out of my like own realm I go. I love books in third person, which I guess gets back to that genesis of originally trying to write fantastical middle grade, but it always seems to come back. Even in The Shape of Thunder, for a while, one of the viewpoints was in third person, because the book is told from 2 different perspectives, and I'd worried a lot about being able to hold 2 separate voices. And so I'd written one of them originally in third person, and then it just didn't like feel right for the book. But I think I learned a lot about the character from starting in that really close third, and then eventually moving it over to first. But yeah, so far I have been very adventurous, I guess, in POV choices. I saw that you made the smart comment that a lot of YA is first person, a lot of middle grade is third person. And I was thinking, oh, but all my middle grade is still first person.
Yeah, so you're the one bucking the trend. And I think that's so interesting, because it is about being able to step into that person's voice and experience. And I suppose the farther we are from that age, the trickier it can feel. But you're even doing it for things like robots. And Carlie, I know you do it for things like dogs and cats.
Dogs and alien cats and lab mice, and yeah.
So what about you? Are there some big differences then in point of view between your YA and middle grade or other? Yeah.
I mean, my YA books focus on the lives of people, while my middle grade books focus on the lives of animals, with humans as side characters. So there's kind of that really dramatic distinction for me in that regard. I mean, all of my books tend to focus on these big things of like belonging and family relationships and things like that. But yeah, middle grade, animals, YA, humans. And I don't know if that will always be that harsh of a distinction, but right now that seems to be the big barrier or distinction. Yeah.
I love it. And what about you, Joy?
Mine are tonally super different. So my middle grades are all present day, realistic, and tend to be more lighthearted and hopeful. Whereas my YA tends to deal with really difficult subjects. There's verse and historical in there. I was actually in a new bookstore the other day that had their YA all shelved by category, which was kind of cool. It was helpful to find things, but I was looking in the contemporary for my newest YA and I couldn't find it. And then I went and asked the bookseller, and it was under gritty. They had a section called that's where my YA was, but my middle grade wouldn't ever be shelved under gritty.
I guess you should take gritty as a compliment. Like, seems like a funny category, though. Gritty fiction. Yeah. With my own, I realized I was doing a talk at a workshop about point of view in children's fiction. And so I did a very unscientific poll of my own shelves and looked at 100 YA books and 100 middle grade books. And yeah, middle grade is like 70% third person point of view, while YA skews really heavily toward first. And in my own writing, completely subconsciously, I've done the same thing. All of my YA is first person, often rotating first person. I'll have multiple narrators, or in the one I'm currently working on, I have a present day narrator and then letters from another character who are like the interruptive chapters, whereas all my middle grade is third person. Also, a lot of my middle grade is mystery, and so I find it very difficult to write mystery in first person, because you want to clue the reader, and especially a young reader, to some of those things that maybe the main character hasn't put together yet. And that's part of the pleasure, that dramatic irony of getting to put the creepy things together that the protagonist hasn't glommed onto. So that I hold true to that trend. What about process? Is there anything different in your writing process when you switch from middle grade to YA? Are there certain tools or fonts, or you write longhand for one and you type for the other? Anything that you use to kind of get yourself into one headspace or the other when you're switching? Joy, let's start with you this time.
Honestly, I have zero difference. It's just all storytelling. It's just all, and this is sort of similar to what Jasmine said, but it's coming at it for the emotional truth of the character I'm writing right then. So, but otherwise, there's no like special light a candle for YA, dance for the middle grade. It's just all doing the work.
And Carlie, what about you? Anything different from one to the other?
It feels totally different for me in almost every way. And again, I'm not like the kind of candles person, but I used to stress quite a lot when I was writing YA. Like my characters would keep me up at night. I remember sitting down to write and just feeling really like worried. And middle grade is super fun. I laugh a lot. If I'm giggling, I know that it means it's working. And there's a quote I really love that I actually do not remember who said it, but she said, "Take writing seriously, but don't take it serious." And that's kind of been my middle grade mantra of like, I take YA so seriously and serious, but middle grade is just like, I'm just rolling. I'm a dog.
That makes sense. How about Jasmine? Anything different in your process?
Well, I actually am a candle person. So every one of my books, I have like a different candle for. There's something like, it's like a part of my process that like I light the candle and I know it's time to write and it's not time to check email and it's not time to worry about all the piles of laundry that I have to do and all those things. And then blowing it out like releases me from that like obligation to myself. And so whatever the scent of the candle is does come to like relate to the book for me, though it's not like chosen purposely, really. It's like whatever was on sale at the store when I went to get the new candle. But for me, again, I think it gets back into trying to really dig into those age groups. So for when I'm writing my YA books, like music was a huge part of my life as a teenager. And I don't actually write to music when I'm writing. It's distracting for me, but I will do a lot of like kind of daydream work around like what songs I'm listening to in the car. If I'm working on a YA book, I'm thinking about being 16 and listening to those songs. And then, I mean, music was a big thing for me when I was 12 too, but in a different way. But it's more like scents. Like I weirdly remember like going to the mall with friends and like Bath and Body Works type stuff. So I like will like think about, I have a friend who told me she went and like bought the same shampoo that she had bought when she was like 11. And just like thinking about those things and placing myself back in those moments of what really worried me when I was 11, what was I really interested in? Because I think the further we get away from that age, the more we can transpose an adult view on the book and be like, this is what the book is about, because this is what is keeping me up now. But more trying to get back to, wait, when I was 11, what would I have thought about it? What was worrying me? And like going through, I have folders my mom gave me of like schoolwork she saved, or like art that I did, and looking at it and trying to remember like the person that I was at that age. So I guess my daydreaming type pre-work or like thinking type work during the projects is different, but it's all getting back to that same thing I said. I feel like I'm being really repetitive on this, I'm sorry, but about just the differences between being a middle schooler and a high schooler and kind of the way your world seems to you and like honoring that fact.
No, that's brilliant. And I love the scent memory idea. That also is, I once wrote a whole poem inspired by the smell of Old Spice deodorant, because that was like high school heartbreak. That was the smell. And like certain car air fresheners can just pull you just like right back to a moment and a certain person. And it's often from, a time when you were young and sort of forming your view of the world. And so those things are still so powerful in your memory. What about you, Akemi? Anything different in process between middle grade and YA?
Yeah, I feel like I do not have a cool answer for this. Both my middle grades were kind of written either fully or partially during the pandemic, basically. And so my process has gone, I don't have one anymore. It's just chaos all the time. I've got 2 kids. It's been a mess. So I feel like I'm just trying to meet deadlines. And if I can just do that, I feel like that's good enough for now. I would like to get back to a place where it's a little bit more organized. I should try the candle thing because that sounds really cool. So,
yeah. You convinced me. Everyone's convinced me about this candles. I was just
yes.
I do that.
Yeah.
The candle should mean
off chaos in my life too. So
okay. Yeah.
I hear you. I have also 2 small children at home, and these days when anyone asks how writing is going, I'm like, I can't even put the words together. There is very little writing going on, and whatever process there is just like desperate cobbling together of words in those first few minutes. But I also realized with my books, and just like Jasmine was saying, in general, I do not listen to music while writing, especially anything with lyrics is just far too distracting. But all of my YAs have had a specific genre or even a certain songwriter who's gone with them. Like my first YA, I was listening to Tori Amos on repeat. My most recent one, Last Things, which is about music, I was listening to scads of metal so much that they're all thanked in the acknowledgements. And my current YA work in progress is also super inspired by music. So middle grade is silent, but my YA is musical for some reason. So some of us have already kind of touched on this when we were talking about, differences between the two. How do you know which one it's going to be? And this is a question I get a lot from teachers and librarians. I'm sure you do too. But how much, if at all, do you think about appropriate content for readership when you are writing middle grade or YA? Do you think about that at all while you're in process and afterward when people ask you to address it? I mean, what do you say? I know some of us write in those gritty areas. So Joy, do you want to start us off with this one? Do you think about content and readership at all?
Sure. I don't think about it at all for YA. And I have an editor who likes to push boundaries a lot anyway. So even earlier on when I might think about it a little bit and I would say, can we do that in YA? His answer was always, yes, do it. So I don't ask anymore, and I really have learned to let that go. Middle grade, only the slightest bit. I mean, I feel like I have an understanding of what middle grade is from reading lots and lots of middle grade, I'm not trying to push boundaries real hard in middle grade, but I'm certainly open to it. And I think middle grade, those middle grade kids are dealing with all the same things, just, sometimes on a different scale, that we are as adults. And so I don't think it's inappropriate. I'm not sure. There's not much I could think of in middle grade that wouldn't be okay if handled, responsibly. So no, I don't think about that too much.
Yeah. What about you, Akemi? Is that an issue for you at all?
Yeah, I agree with Joy. I think there's like a lot of, when you're talking about content too, when you're talking about, things that are heavier, like if you're talking about abuse or whatever the situation is, I mean, there's not an age limit on that in real life. And I feel like sometimes people try to act like, oh, that content's too old. And it's like, there's kids who are going through that. It doesn't matter what age they are. And it's very sad. But, and I feel like they need those books too. I think for me, a lot of what I write is sometimes alluded to more off the page, but that's not to say that every book should be like that by any means, but I think that's just kind of like the way that I approach it for me. And I think the only thing that maybe I'm consciously thinking about is probably like language. Like obviously my middle grade's not full of like the F words. So, I mean, that's kind of like the only difference, but otherwise, yeah, it's just sort of getting in the head of somebody that age, but then, respecting the fact that they could have all different kinds of experiences and it's not limited to, what somebody wants to categorize it, I guess, for a bookshelf. But yeah, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. How about you, Jasmine?
Yeah, I agree. Both of my middle grade books deal with, I guess, tougher topics, and that other words for home, like tackles the refugee crisis and Islamophobia, and The Shape of Thunder is about gun violence and like the aftermath of a school shooting. And so both of these are pretty weighty topics. But I think for me, I agree with what has already been said, that our kids are dealing with these things. And so for me, the line is always, there's nothing in any of my books that I think most middle grade readers wouldn't already be aware of in their world. More for me, it's about honoring the fact that books are really amazing conversation starters. I think grownups often create these like silos of silence around issues that make them really uncomfortable. And it's in books that kids can find a way into that conversation. I know that for me, when I was younger, I would sometimes use books to like broker those more difficult conversations with my parents or things like that, because it's easier to talk about something that you know is making your parent or your teacher uncomfortable if it's within the context of a story. And so actually The Shape of Thunder was informed a lot by all the school visits I was doing pre-pandemic with Other Words for Home, and that I was seeing how hungry students were to talk about lockdown drills and talk about this ever-present kind of threat of violence. And so again, it's about like honoring what it means to be an 11-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old today in America, and writing books that meet them at their level where they are. So I'm never trying to like shock or, you know, write something that's like super edgy. I think sometimes the books get labeled as being edgier than they are, because there's like, we live in this kind of idea of wanting to think that being 11 is different than what actually being 11 today is. And so I'm always trying to negotiate that. But it's also, you know, in The Shape of Thunder, the girls are working to time travel, and they really believe in the possibility of this like intersection between magic and science. And that's what I remember from being 11 and 12. It was like this intersection of that childhood ability to have like enormous imagination with this understanding of a lot of like the scarier and stickier parts of the world. And I think that's what really, really interests me about middle grade and lights me up, is getting to play to that intersection, that you can still be a kid who wants to be drawing like all these fantastical characters from this imaginary world that's inside your head, while also being really upset about like systematic racism that exists in this country. And those two things live inside our kids, and they can both exist in a book. And so I think that's, like I said, what really interests me about middle grade and how I think about writing middle grade, that sort of imaginative quality. Not that teenagers aren't imaginative, but that possibility of it exists more in the merging of these like trickier topics than it does when I like approach them in YA.
Yes, for sure. I think what you were just saying too about it's a sort of protective instinct. I think a lot of teachers, librarians, parents, you know, don't want to expose kids to a certain subject or idea. Although of course the kid has probably already been exposed to that in all kinds of ways, not just, you know, through the other people they know, but through media all around them, through life experiences. And so when we act like that subject is not appropriate, you know, for this age, we're kind of telling them that their own experiences are inappropriate. Like they can't voice them, like they can't, you know, speak about them openly. And so, yeah, the books that show a kid, nope, you're not alone, here's a way to converse about that, are so meaningful. And I mean, I primarily write in fantasy veins, so a lot of what I'm writing is not about, you know, the same sort of real world problems, but I'm certainly thinking about things like fear. And I try to write what I think the book needs, because I know that each individual reader needs something different too, you know, and that there will be some kids who just like, that's their escapism. They like the creepy fiction. They like this kind of thing, while someone else might want to close it and it's just not for them. And so I also think it just speaks to the need for book choice for kids who are reading middle grade and YA fiction. Like the more they are able to decide for themselves what books speak to them, what books interest them, what books are right for them and feed them, like that's so important. What about you, Carlie? Want to add anything to the?
Yeah, so my perspective is just a little bit different, specifically because of the animal component. So because my middle grade deals so heavily with animals, I think quite a lot, not in terms of what is like inappropriate, but what would be overly upsetting for like an 8 to 12-year-old to know about how humans have historically treated animals and how they still treat them now. So my next middle grade novel is from the perspective of a lab mouse, and balancing that was really, really tricky, because I wanted to show readers that like labs are really awful for animals. You know, this lab mouse is in mortal peril. But if I'd actually shown the exact trauma that is inflicted towards animals and labs, I wouldn't want to read that book. I wouldn't want my kid reading that book, because it's like I would just give up on humanity at age 12. So it was a really tricky balance, because I don't want to inflict any trauma on my readers. And I was thinking about what are the books that impacted me as a kid, but also I haven't really gotten over. And I think of things like Where the Red Fern Grows. Did both dogs need to die at the end? I don't know. So yeah, I think about that all the time for middle grade. Never for YA. YA, it's just kind of like whatever goes, they can deal with it. They're dealing with it now. But animal is a little different. And maybe that's because I'm so like sensitive about animals that I just kind of foist that onto readers. But
no, I completely understand that. Oh my gosh, my 5th grade teacher, Mr. Anderson, read Where the Red Fern Grows aloud to all of us, and he openly wept. And that's still just like seared into my mind, not just because like we were all crying, but here's Mr. Anderson crying about a book. Like it was just this really powerful. Oh, I can still quote those. No, I won't, because they're too heavy. But yes, Where the Red Fern Grows. So, and kind of as a follow-up to that, there's such a big gap in readership between the standard middle grade reader and YA reader. We know like YA readers, half of them are adults, and many YA protagonists are 17, 18. They're at the upper end of the teenage age frame, while middle grade tends to be like 11 is that magic age, of most protagonists. So there's this wide gap, and there's a lot of talk about the need for upper MG, things that are aimed at that 14, 15-year-old reader who's between adulthood and childhood. Are any of you working in upper MG or thinking about doing it? Anybody writing in that kind of category? Nobody.
Across the Pond is a bit upper. Sort of her emotional backstory is before they moved to Scotland, she's had this big friendship breakup, and part of it involved the friend group going to a party at the beach that was filled with high schoolers drinking, and her ending up calling her mom to pick her up, and her friends getting mad at her and stuff. So it's dealing with stuff that's not she's 12. But they've just graduated from middle school. And the middle grade that I'm working on right now that's not really out at all is all dealing with, well, actually, I can't. I don't think I can talk about it yet. But yeah, I'm working in that space a little bit too. I have a 15-year-old, and she actually reads both middle grade and YA, and she mostly reads YA now, but she still really loves middle grade and even some of the middle grade that wouldn't be considered upper, that's just straight up middle grade. And I think that sometimes we create these categories as gatekeepers that readers are just readers, and I mean, I love middle grade, and I'm certainly well past 12, so she really loves both, and it's about the story for her.
Absolutely. So Jasmine, you kind of addressed this, and when you're writing, switching into that, the headspace to write and to honor, that 12-year-old perspective. So when you are writing middle grade, are you writing specifically for your own younger self? Are you thinking about, 11 or 12-year-old you? And then when you switch to YA, are you thinking about high school age you? Or do you have a different kind of imaginary ideal reader, maybe a child of your own, somebody who you are envisioning as the reader for your middle grade or YA fiction? Jasmine, would you start us off with that?
Yeah, I guess for me it's a hybrid. I use myself because I am the only 11-year-old, 12-year-old who I've ever known the actual inner workings of their mind. So that's all I have access to. But the wonderful thing about this work, and I think this has been a little bit interrupted because of the pandemic and the inability to do in-person school visits, but still do virtual ones, is that the work feeds itself. So after writing a middle grade book and then getting to go and do school visits and have wonderful conversations with young readers, they sort of merge into this other collective idea I have. And I think about them a lot and wanting to write a book, again, that honors them and challenges them and also uplifts them. I think, getting back to your other question, I was sitting here thinking about the other piece of it, which I didn't mention, is that I always want to write challenging books because I actually think those are empowering books, because they tell the reader, I see you and I care what you think and I know you have an opinion. But I also think, especially with middle grade, it's so important to write books that are honest and tell the truth about how hard the world is, because kids know when you're being false with them, but that also gives them a sense that they can make the world better. I think that hope portion is so important in middle grade, that they leave with this feeling that they don't feel flattened by the honesty of the book, but they feel like uplifted by it. And so I guess I think about myself. I mean, I also think about myself, and I think lots of us who come from backgrounds where we didn't see ourselves in books think about that a lot when we're writing. I thought a lot about that while I was writing Other Words for Home, that, you know, I never saw a girl like Jude at the center of a story in a book that I could have found in my middle school library. But I wasn't writing the book for me. I was writing the book for kids who would now find Jude's story. And I also thought about that. And I also had to be honest about the ways the world has changed since I was a middle schooler. So I definitely always think about younger readers outside of myself. My kids are 4 and 5, and so they aren't middle grade readers yet. But they definitely like inform my writing, and I think have informed my interest in maybe writing younger, just because I'm getting to read so many of those fun like younger middle grade chapter books with them and remembering the joy of that genre. But yeah, so I guess that's a messy hybrid answer. So I meditate a lot on my own experience because it's the only one I have to know to write from, but then really try to think about all the other young readers that are out there who the book is for.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a perfect answer. What about you, Akemi? Do you have an ideal reader or your younger self, or?
Yeah, I think I write a lot of books. I'm similar, like that when I was growing up, there was no like hardly any that I could find easily about half Asian characters. And so for me, that was when I started writing, I was like, that's the books that I wanted to write, is for the younger me who couldn't find those books on the shelves. So I feel like it's kind of self-indulgent sometimes, because sometimes I do write a book that I'm like, this is just straight up something that I would have loved. and that's it. I know that's a little bit selfish maybe, but yeah, so I think that is probably the foundation of it. I do keep in mind though, you know, like Jasmine said about writing for also the kids who are going to find themselves now. And I think, but I think the core of it is definitely, what did I think was cool that I wish that I could have seen? And yeah, so.
What about you, Carlie? Is your younger self in mind? Someone?
Yes, I think I'm just going to kind of parrot everyone else's answer, but I obviously was obsessed with animals as a kid, still am, and I've tried to write stories that I would kind of appreciate at that age. And as Jasmine was saying, like the more young readers you meet during school visits, I think the more just naturally you write for them in mind, because they're part of your conscious now. Like they're with you. I also think that for both my middle grade and my YA, as both of the other panelists were saying, like I'm biracial. I never saw biracial families represented in middle grade fiction, really, when I was growing up. So I wanted to make sure that was in there, because that was really important to me.
Mm-hmm. And Joy, what about you?
I mean, I think that my experiences as a kid and as a teen definitely inform my writing, but I don't consciously think about, I'm writing this because this is the book I would have wanted. And I am also coming from the place of privilege as a white, straight Christian, you know, who saw myself in books. That's all there was on books. So I don't have that experience. But I do think about my kids. You know, I have an 11 and a 15-year-old. And so I'm not writing for them. But, you know, they are the kids I interact with the most, and, you know what they're interested in, and how they talk, and their friends. And yeah, so those kids, I think, are impacting me more than thinking about what I would have wanted as a kid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All of you are making me miss in-person school visits so much, because it's true how much that feeds your work, which often, you know, as writers, we are by ourselves in our houses or with our few small children in our houses. And then, yeah, getting to go out and meet the actual readers who are full of brilliant questions and enthusiasm. Yeah, I know I have started more and more writing for this, a little bit more nebulous idea of that's my reader. I think also when I started out, my Books of Elsewhere series was very much for my 2 younger brothers. You know, it was the kind of thing I would have read aloud to my own family. And then when I finished it, I think it was Akemi, who said you thought it was selfish to just think, I would have liked this as a kid. And that was my thought. Like, I would have liked this as a kid. Maybe other kids would like it too, which is the only thing that made me feel brave enough, to start submitting that book. Maybe other kids have the same taste. But yeah, the more I've written, bless you. The more broad my feeling of who that reader might be has gotten. So are there any big differences you've noticed in terms of publishing when it comes to middle grade and YA? Are there big differences in marketing and promotion and reader interaction? There can be quite different fields. Carlie, can you start us off with that one?
Yeah, I mean, such huge differences in pretty much every aspect with my YA books. Like my YA books commercially, they never really broke out. They never went anywhere. I don't want to use the word bombed, but I'm going to use the word bombed. And middle grade has just been a completely different experience for me, especially in terms of reader interaction. There's nothing better than a heartfelt letter from like a 9-year-old. First of all, they always tell you their age right at the beginning, which I love. Like, I'm 9 years old. And I always thought it would be super odd, but wonderful if adults did that. Like, I'm just going to do that with all of my publishing emails from now on. But I think it's just really charming. And they also name their pets after your characters, which was just my ultimate author goal. So there are now just like Cosmos and Leonards running around specifically in the UK. And that warms my heart. Yeah.
The same, yes. There's nothing better than a letter from a reader, especially when they send you a drawing. Oh, it's the best. And yes, there are 3 cats in the books of Elsewhere who now have, there are multiple little Horatios and Harveys out there in the real world, and it makes me so much happier than I can express. How about you, Joy? Any big differences between the publishing experiences?
Well, my debut YA came out in 2018, but everything else has come out in the pandemic. And so I kind of feel like big differences, but I don't know what's pandemic and what's category, and But the one thing I can point to is that in YA, I feel like in terms of who I interact with, I interact with the YA readers more directly, and with middle grade, I tend to be interacting more with the teachers and librarians than the actual readers. And I don't do a ton of school visits, though. I think that's probably how middle grade writers, get to interact with the readers more. But in terms of social media and online interaction, I feel like I'm able to be more directly in touch with YA readers and not so much the middle grade readers. But yeah, I'm really eager to see what the differences are more once we get out of this current moment.
Yeah. Akemi, what about you?
Yeah, I think I've also had the books come out during the pandemic too. Generation Misfits has not even been out for a month yet, and so I feel like I can't really gauge the effects because whenever the book comes out, you don't really know how it's doing until 6 months at least minimum later, And all of my books have been kind of quiet. They have that sort of slower build up. I've heard, and I don't know if this was true, but I remember before my middle grade came out, somebody had said that that one of the differences that YA sometimes gets splashier promo and middle grade doesn't, but then sometimes the middle grade ends up being more successful. And I don't know if that's true. I'm hoping that maybe it is, and we'll see in 6 months. But so I think that sometimes there's more of a online noise with YA. That's kind of what I kind of felt with my experience, and middle grade doesn't have that same thing, probably because most middle grade readers aren't necessarily on publishing Twitter and stuff like that. So yeah, it was kind of nicer actually to take a step back and be I don't have to do this as much. I can take a break and just focus on the words. So yeah.
And how about you, Jasmine? Your first 2 were YA, right? And then the next 2 middle grade. So have you noticed big differences in the publishing experience?
Yeah, I think it's what everyone's been getting at, that the way YA is marketed is more consumer facing, because teens or the adult readers of YA often are the ones who are going to the bookstore and making those purchasing choices. And for middle grade, a lot of the purchasing power is in teachers and librarians and even parents. And so I think it's different in the content that you're asked to generate. So when it's YA, it's really, the videos are for the readers, which has a different feel than when you're asked to make a video talking about the book for librarians. And so I think it's just, again, this feel of where the marketing is being targeted. But I agree, probably I'm offline right now. But when I was, my sense would be that YA was more buzzy online just because that's more of a tool because the readers are there. Not that there aren't wonderful educators and librarians online that they're trying to reach, but I think that the way that middle grade is marketed is less of like a buzzy online campaign and more at those like institutionalized like conferences like ALA or NCTE, where you can reach educators and librarians. And then the school visit part, I think, is a much bigger thing in middle grade. I didn't do a lot of school visits. I only did a couple for my YA books, and then school visits have been a big part of the middle grade book experience, which they're exhausting, but I really love them because you're getting to interact with the actual kids. So yeah, I think like that is probably, I would say is the big difference is like middle grade, it feels like less direct marketing. I'm not sure if that's the right term for how like what the marketing term is, but it seems like in YA, that's like how the campaigns are built around really directly addressing the reader. Whereas for middle grade, I feel like I get asked to do videos that are clearly going to be shown to like a group of librarians as opposed to like a group of fifth graders.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Oh, definitely. Well, we are running out of time, so I would love to have everyone really briefly tell us, if you can, what's your next thing. If you have a work in progress or something that's about to be published, give us a little teaser. Let's start with Jasmine.
All right. Yeah. So I have a new middle grade book that's coming out next fall. That is called Resilience, and it is about a Mars rover and their journey from being built in the NASA lab to journeying to Mars. And so we've kind of been calling it like One and Only Ivan, but with robots. So there's Resilience, who is the rover, and then their drone helicopter Fly and the orbiter in the sky. So all the different characters are NASA vehicles, and it's very different from anything I've ever written before. So it's clearly my pandemic book, but I love it. It's such a joy to work on, and weirdly, it might be the closest in writing style to Other Words for Home, because while it's not in verse, it's in really like kind of sparse prose in the way you might imagine a robot would talk. And so it's been really fun to return to kind of like a more experimental type form for the book. So yeah.
Oh, I love it. It sounds fabulous. Carlie, how about you? What is next?
So first of all, sorry about my computer. It's overheating, which is why I've been muting it if you hear noise in the background. But I have a bunch of books coming out next year. One is called Roar Like a Lion, and it is a nonfiction book about animals giving advice on how to live your best life. So for example, the hedgehog on courage, or the wombat on welcoming your neighbors. And it's fully illustrated, it's beautiful, and I get to talk about all sorts of animals. So I'm happy.
Oh, lovely. All right. And Akemi, what about you?
The next book I have coming out is the second book in the Infinity Court series. It's called The Genesis Wars. That series is about an AI who basically takes over the afterlife. And I won't spoil anything because it's the second book, obviously, but it's got like a mix of fantasy and sci-fi. It's sort of like a blur of the two, with like all like good old-fashioned dystopian rebels and stuff like that. And my next middle grade, I can't even talk about it because it's so early and such a mess that it doesn't even have a title. So there will be ghosts in it. That's as much as I can say. Yeah.
There will be ghosts. Good enough. All right. Joy, what's next?
My next YA comes out in March of next year, and it's a co-authored Little Women retelling with Tess Sharp, Carolyn Teng Richmond, and Jessica Spotswood, where we've each written one sister. So I'm really excited about that. And then I have a middle grade coming out in the summer that's way out, but it's another contemporary, and this one's a theater book.
Oh, fabulous. All right. Well, we are out of time, but thank you everyone for joining us at Middle Ground Book Fest. Feel free to find us all online, get in touch. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.